All right, we'll get our recording started. I'm going to put my prayer book away, and we are in the fifth chapter of Daniel. Um, Fifth chapter of Daniel tonight. We finished up the fourth chapter, and that with the fourth chapter we finished. Oh, any questions before we get started? I'll try and start with that every time. Any questions we've got that you might have been thinking about, or questions or comments or things that you've learned this week? Any any of those before we get started? In the meantime, be turning to Daniel chapter 5.
Remember Jerry asked about the tree of the band there?
Yeah.
Um, well, I was listening to someone else's interpretation, and
Mm-hmm.
they referenced that tree and the band as something going on today. And I thought that was quite interesting that somebody related it something going on today.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what they said.
And and remember, as we look at that, and this should always be coming back to our minds here, that dream statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw, that is that looks like, from top to bottom, from gold to iron, that looks like the span of the time of the Gentiles to me. um, and we of course are in the time of the Gentiles now, and um, and we are told several times in the gospel that the end the end of days will come when the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So thinking of that, that means that as we get down to, get down through Media, Persia, and Greece, and down through Rome, and then we get into those feet that we're still struggling with to identify, where iron is mixed with clay in the feet, and then the rock that comes from the mountain shatters the feet, and then the whole thing comes apart. That's kind of, I think, a reflection of the end, when Jesus and his Father will return to the earth and set everything right. So that means, and you remember the bands on the stump of the tree of Babylon are bronze and iron. So that iron band would be, Bonnie, and I think that's probably where they get their interpretation, would be this time at the end of the statue, when the leftovers of the Roman Empire are mixed with the clay that make it unstable. So
Yeah.
that would be speaking exactly of the iron part of the statue, which is at the end. And since that stump of Babylon is bound by that iron, and remember that iron will be shattered, and Babylon, if we kind of take a little peek ahead to Revelation, Babylon will return in Revelation when we get there. So Babylon is coming back. So that interpretation, that stump was reserved for Nebuchadnezzar when he came back, that's also a little foreshadowing of that prophecy towards the end, where the Babylonian Empire will come back near the end of days. So yeah, I think that interpretation is probably true.
Yeah.
So yeah, we got to keep our eyes on the Middle East. Middle East is where things are gonna be. So yeah, thank you for that, Bonnie. Any other questions or things that you've heard this week? Yeah, if you do hear something like that in your reading or your watching, please bring them up, because it's good to hear that there are other people thinking along those same lines too. So last week we finished up with Nebuchadnezzar, and we read that last paragraph in chapter 4, is where Nebuchadnezzar came back from his madness and was restored to his kingship. And remember when we read it, it was almost like reading a psalm. In fact, I'm going to read that last paragraph in chapter 4 to begin tonight. And remember, chapter 4, also remember, is in Nebuchadnezzar's voice. I mean, he probably didn't write this out. He probably dictated it to a scribe, but he could have written it. But it is his words that we've got here in chapter 4. Very unique situation where we got a pagan actually writing part of the Bible here. But we start in that last paragraph in chapter 4, verse 34 there. At the end of the days, I Nebuchadnezzar lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. All right, his madness has gone away, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, What have you done? At the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. And now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol the honor the King of heaven. For all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. A lot of people say that this was Nebuchadnezzar's confession, and that he actually called upon the name of the Lord here and was saved. And it's a convincing argument, and I can't say no for sure, but I also went back to check another pagan. In fact, this is a Syrian, another pagan who got who had a encounter with God in the Old Testament. So if you flip over to 2 Kings, this pagan, and I think we may have to change that designation. This pagan, in quotes, was mentioned in the New Testament. Chapter 5 in 2 Kings starts like this. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord, that's Jehovah, the Lord had given victory to Syria. This is the story of Naaman, the leper. And remember, he's mentioned in the 4th chapter of Luke. Story of Nebuchadnezzar. The story of Naaman, real quick. Naaman was a great commander in Syria. Great man, mighty warrior. Single-handedly delivered Syria from in many battles. Um, but he had leprosy. And remember, there was a captive little Jewish girl that was in his household that said, Why don't you go to the man of God? Naaman was traveling about the Middle East, and he was over in Israel at this point. The little girl said, Why don't you, there's a mighty man of God right down the road. Why don't you go to him and see if he can heal you? So Naaman trots over, and this mighty man of God happens to be Elisha. He goes over to Elisha, and and this is not a minor character. This is a mighty man, a very famous man here. He goes with his entourage to Elisha's house, and Elisha sends a servant out to talk to him, and he's not happy about this. So in that 5th chapter, again, we're in verse 11 now. But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of Jehovah, his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. So Naaman had this idea that Elisha was going to come out, pronounce some great pronouncement on him, and cure his leprosy. And he didn't. So Naaman was a little bit angry, and he left in a huff. But his men, probably knowing that the commander is a little bit hot-headed sometimes, calms him down and says, "Why don't you just do it?" He goes, dips in the Jordan River 7 times, and voila, he's clean. So we pick this up, and this is the important part. We pick this up in the fifth chapter again, and we look at verse 15. Then he, Naaman, returned to the man of God, that's Elisha, and he and his company, and he came and stood before Elisha and said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant. And Elisha says, As Jehovah lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And then Naaman, urged Elisha to take it, but Elisha again refused. Then Naaman said, If not, please let there be given to your servant, that's him, 2 mule loads of earth, for from now on your servant will not offer burnt offerings or sacrifices to any god but Jehovah. In this manner, may Jehovah pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, that's the Syrian god, leaning on my arm, I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, Jehovah pardon your servant in this manner. And Elisha said, Go in peace. So Naaman mentioned God, but he used God's name, Jehovah. He used God's Yud-He Vav-He, God's personal name 3 times. And he asked for forgiveness of God when he goes into this house that he has to take his master into. And he is mentioned in Luke as having faith. So we are looking here no longer at a pagan. We're looking at a member of God's family. We're looking at an adopted son of Abraham here in the form of Naaman the leper. And the difference between his pronouncement and Nebuchadnezzar's pronouncement is that Nebuchadnezzar never uses and doesn't appear to know God's personal name. So, in my mind, that means that Nebuchadnezzar, although he respected, he thought he elevated Jehovah to a high position in the Babylonian hierarchy of gods, he still considered Jehovah just one of the pantheon of gods that Babylon worshipped. That's what I think is the difference between Nebuchadnezzar, and even though it's very beautiful language and sounds just like many of our psalms, Nebuchadnezzar still was lost. So read carefully, because it sounds very convincing, Nebuchadnezzar's speech. But there's always one thing missing. And in this case, Nebuchadnezzar did not know God's most holy name, and who did was Daniel. And Daniel would have pronounced God's most holy name many times. Many times. Nebuchadnezzar had heard it, but he had never really heard it. So watch, read carefully, because God does not leave us in the dark. Naaman, he is a brother. Nebuchadnezzar, very well respected by God, appointed because God needed a man of his special talents, but Nebuchadnezzar never made the connection between the Most High or the King of Heaven or the kingdom, his kingdom enjoy. He never made the connection between that one, those those titles, and Jehovah, our Father. So, just wanted to bring that up before we continue on. End of chat. Any questions on that? End of chapter 4. We leave Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar ruled over Babylon 40 something years. We're not exactly sure, 40 something years. And remember, um, Jeremiah said, "You will rule, your son will rule, and your grandson will rule." So there were a series of kings that went after Nebuchadnezzar. Um, this king that we're going to come up on is a challenge, or used to be a challenge. Chapter 5, verse 1. Start our reading. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. That's how we start off with Belshazzar. Belshazzar was it calls him the king of Babylon. And he had a great feast, thousands. Birthday party, who knows? Wedding party. He was having a massive feast. The name Belshazzar was used by the Bible critics because we did not have a king in all of the Babylonian records that we have preserved. There was not a king named Belshazzar. So they say immediately, well, of course, the Bible's got a problem here. There was no king Belshazzar. Well, just recently, last few years, they actually began to look at some of the records that some of the Babylonian records that these are clay tablets, so they're in museums all over, and people don't have enough time to look at all of them. So occasionally a professor will come along and pull some out that have never been looked at and begin to translate them. And that happened. And lo and behold, we found two kings lists recently. Well, guess what they found? There's a king named Belshazzar, king of Babylon, and apparently a very famous one too. So once again, the first the first thing that the Bible critics and the Bible scholars assume that the Bible's making it up unless they have some history to back it up. We do it the opposite. We assume that this town or this king that's not mentioned in any of our historical records, just give it some time, we'll probably find it. Same thing happened here. So Belshazzar is historically mentioned in Babylonian records that we have, and was a king of Babylon. In fact, the last one. And we'll see right here why. Continuing on, verse 2. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought out the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and wood and stone. So Belshazzar was having a good time. In fact, he got so happy that he decided to do something that, and it mentions his father, but Nebuchadnezzar was by no means his father. This is like 20 years past Nebuchadnezzar. And we know Nebuchadnezzar's sons, they are well documented. So this is a later king, and according to the records, this king actually was not related to Nebuchadnezzar. He was the son of a military king. He inherited the king as a military commander when Nebuchadnezzar's line left. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was not a great king, did not last very long, and the army basically took over for him because he was such a weak king. The army commander that took over, and I can't remember his name right now, it just jumped out of my head, something with a C. His son was named Belshazzar. So this king, this military leader, his son was was serving as king at this point. And it gets complicated. The history is kind of complicated, and I'm not really interested in that. But if you listen to Tom's recordings, he goes through the history. He knows the history backwards and forwards. It's interesting history, but I'm more interested in the Bible here. So um, Belshazzar was, and it says his Nebuchadnezzar, his father. The the term father in the Old Testament is used in a lot of different senses. Uh, a lot of times you will hear um, some of the Jews that are mentioned in the Old Testament say, "Father, my father Abraham." So it's used like that. So this is not the Bible in error here saying Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's son.
Oh,
Um, it is just a term that is used, and we use it too. Father Abraham. We mention that. So it's not an error here. It's just a term of endearment, remembering the great Nebuchadnezzar. So Belshazzar gets and Belshazzar doesn't know the God of the Hebrews like Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar never did this. He did not touch those golden uh, vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. He knew better than to do that. Belshazzar, yeah, he wasn't so bright. He wasn't so bright. So he had those golden vessels brought out to drink out of and celebrate whatever they're celebrating. 4th of July in Babylon. And this is the same mistake, not on as much as a big a scale, but a same kind of mistake when Nebuchadnezzar went on the roof of his captive and said, "This is the great Babylon that I have made." And God told him, "Remember that second dream, son? This is where you step over the line." And God struck him with madness. Well, Belshazzar is about to get struck more than madness. So they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, wood, iron, and stone. Immediately, next verse, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's men came out, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet hall. She heard the commotion. Something's going on. And the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians and the enchanters, and the Chaldeans and the astrologers, because of an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems, were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. The queen, once again, it's mentioned that your father Nebuchadnezzar, this is just a term of respect for Nebuchadnezzar, just like we call George Washington the father of our country. It's not the father of all the country. She's referring to Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar was such a mighty uh, figure here. Nebuchadnezzar ruled 40 years. The rest of these guys ruled a handful of years. So that's what she's talking about. This is not his son. But the queen had a better memory than this character. The queen had been paying attention while all this was happening, so she knew who Daniel was. She knew Daniel was the answer. So, next paragraph, verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah. You notice how he didn't call him slaves. Joseph got called a slave when he was in Egypt. So the Babylonians did not treat the Jews badly. You are Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, and that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing, and made known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed in purple and have a gold chain around your neck, and shall be the third in the kingdom. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let your gifts be for yourself, and let your reward to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king, and made known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness he gave him, all the people and nations and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would raise up, and whom he would be humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, and was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him, and he was driven from among the children of men, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys, and he was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind, and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. and the vessels of the house that he has brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drank wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Once again, Daniel is giving the king a chance to look at his ways and turn from them. You notice in Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel tried to get him to turn many times, and sometimes he took his word and turned. But it took punishment from God to turn him finally from his ways to a reasonably humble man, apparently, at the end. Belshazzar, yeah, not so much. So let's pick it up. But notice how Daniel gave him a warning. Gave him a warning. Then from his presence, the then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parshin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided, and you will be given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be third in the kingdom. So Daniel, once again, Daniel wasn't. You notice how he was reluctant to give Nebuchadnezzar that last interpretation of his second dream. Daniel was a little reluctant to give that to his king. In fact, he said, "May this be for somebody else. May this interpretation be somebody else," even though Daniel knew it wasn't. Not so much with Belshazzar. Not so much with Belshazzar. He gives Belshazzar the bad news right out of the gate and tells him exactly what's going to happen.
I think it's because Daniel's a little old and crusty at that point. He didn't care.
That's true. That's true.
That's first.
Daniel's
He'd
probably
been down that road before.
yep. And plus, remember, Nebuchadnezzar was God's chosen, was God's appointed ruler. God made him ruler of Babylon. Specifically, Isaiah, Jeremiah says it, and we've read it many times in 27 Jeremiah. Jeremiah pronounced Nebuchadnezzar as the ruler. God said it. Belshazzar, no. And Belshazzar is out of the time that God gave Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. He gave Babylon 3 generations: Father, Son, and Spirit. Father, Son, and Spirit. Father, Son, and grandson.
Wouldn't that have made him a grandson though? I mean,
According to the records, he wasn't related. The last relation that we can get out of the Babylonian records is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. After that, the kingdom was ruled by a military potentate, and then this Belshazzar is the son of that military guy, and I still can't remember his name. But
okay.
So he's out of time right now. God gave Babylon 3 generations, and he's giving them some more time, but he's living on borrowed time. Belshazzar is not related to Nebuchadnezzar by blood.
Him being third ruler, wasn't that a demotion? I mean, wasn't he like second under Nebuchadnezzar because he was head of all the other
He
strong?
was second under Nebuchadnezzar, but remember he's now under this military guy, and according to the records, giving him third in command, this military fellow, and I sure wish I could remember his name. This military fellow was the king of Babylon.
Uh,
His son, this military guy was a very strong warrior and was out conquering or maintaining order in the outer regions of the Babylonian kingdom. He was out conquering more land and didn't show up in the palace very much, according to the records. And remember, these are spotty records at best. The Babylonian history is spotty records, but we do have indications that this military leader, I still can't draw his name. This military leader was a man of action. He was out there conquering people, and his son
Is it Cyrus?
ruled in his place while dad was out in the field.
Is it Cyrus?
no.
His son, this Belshazzar. Belshazzar was the son of this military leader who I can't remember the name of.
Was it Abel Merodach?
No, that was the grandson.
Okay.
Um, no, I'm sorry, that was the son. Merodach was the son.
Okay.
Um, so Daniel being third in line, that would be military king Belshazzar, Daniel. That's how it seems to fit together. The military leader, who was the true king, the heir apparent, who's Belshazzar, and now Daniel was appointed under Belshazzar. So actually, he was sort of in the same place because dad was gone a lot.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So Belshazzar gave, and after he gives him this horrible news, Belshazzar at least was a man of his word and goes in and gives him the robe, gives him the chain, and gives him the position. At least Belshazzar was a man of his word, even though he was drunk out of his mind. Because remember, they had been drinking a long time before they brought the vessels in. So Daniel once again pronounces a judgment on the king of Babylon. He does not respect this guy near as much as he does Nebuchadnezzar, mainly because Nebuchadnezzar was appointed to that position by God. This guy was just the next in line. And now we read the last verse. Verse 30. At that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede, this is important, Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Darius was 62 years old, and he received the kingdom. Doesn't say he conquered it. Doesn't say he came in and killed it. It says he received the kingdom. And this, when you look at the history of the end of Babylon and the beginning of the Media-Persia Empire, this fits actually nicely with what we are able to figure out. Like I said, the records are real spotty in the history of Babylon, but if we use the Bible as a guide, it kind of fits with some of the accounts on how Babylon fell. It seems that the Persians snuck in, and Jeff's better historian at this than I am. That was Herodotus wrote that, right, Jeff?
Yeah, he told how it happened. What happened was they had diverted the river so they could walk in on a dry bed because they had the river actually running through the city as an irrigation system for their marvelous gardens they had. So, and those gardens went up like 3 stories.
Yeah.
And they were on a kind of a terrace system. So that's why they called them the one of the wonders of the world, because of all the gardens that were hanging down and the water would just run.
Yeah.
The way they had it set up. So, so what they did was while they were in there partying and having their time, they had been quietly all during that time moving the river slightly over so they could walk on a dry bed.
So they snuck in, and it probably wasn't much of a fight because they were all drunk anyway.
Yeah.
And Belshazzar was said to have been killed trying to defend the city with his army. The historical piece that seems to fit well was that actually the army that came in was the Persian army, and the Persian army was led by Cyrus the Great. The Persian army came in, did the work, but didn't really want to mess with Babylon right now. So they appointed Darius, who was an old man, to rule Babylon while the Persians went somewhere else and did conquering on their own. The Persians and the Medes were very close. They were related. They were related by birth a couple of generations back. So they were a very close, two close people groups. They just simply turned the kingdom over to Darius. That's why it says receive the kingdom. They turned the kingdom over to Darius to rule while the Persians went and took care of business somewhere else. So that seems to be the good story. All right, we are about out of time. I almost went too long. Are there any questions about, look over chapter 5, make sure there are no questions, and we will start chapter 6 next week. Any questions before we leave?
No, great lesson.
All right. Well, like I said, chapter 5, that was a short one, but there's a lot in there. Look over it again. If you have questions next week, bring them and let's answer them before we go on to the Lion's Den. Lion's Den is next week. We will spend probably a couple of weeks in Lion's Den. All right. Any other questions or comments before we go?
We enjoyed the lesson.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you
you.
very much. Thank you all
Good
for
night,
coming.
everybody.
Have a good week.
Right.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
All right.
Bye. Bye.
Good night,
See you guys
everybody.
next week.
Good night.
Bye.